Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1301. And today what we're going to be going over is that of the market revolution, which will be one of the consequences or the outcomes to the War of 1812. Now, over the course of the next couple of lectures, we're going to be focusing on how the War of 1812 is going to have a tremendous impact on America socially, culturally, economically, as well as politically. And today we're going to be focusing mostly on how it's going to impact the nation economically and how it's going to completely revolutionize American society and begin to drastically change away from what it had looked like during the colonial period. Now, to understand the end of the War of 1812, we need to understand a couple of things. First, what we're going to see is, especially after that Hartford Convention, America is going to enter a period of political harmony, better known as the era of good feelings, to where the Federalist Party will no longer be an issue to the Republicans. There would only be a one-party system for the U.S. for the course of the next decade. And this new Republican Party that emerges out of the War of 1812, they're going to be instilled with a sense of nationalist pride. They are starting to view themselves for the first time as Americans. And after the end of the War of 1812, they were looking to expand the prestige of the federal government both at home as well as abroad. And we'll talk about those implications later on. But one of those aspects to where they wanted to expand American prestige and improve their nation will be through the buildup of infrastructure. And this will be one of the lingering consequences that Madison is going to have to address at the end of the War of 1812. Now, after the end of the war, in 1815, Madison is going to deliver an address to Congress to where he's going to call for infrastructure improvements. The reason being is because during the War of 1812, as we had seen last time in lecture, America was on the verge at times of losing that conflict, mainly because they did not have a national bank, they did not have a strong road or infrastructure system, as well as other reasons, which we'll talk about in the era of good feelings. And he recognizes this when he calls for the buildup of the nation's infrastructure, because he understood it was vital for the nation's defense to build up a sophisticated road system as well as a trading network, so that way you could quickly transport troops from, say, Canada down towards the U.S. Capitol and so on and so forth. And so he will call for these infrastructure improvements. Now, I want to stress this once again. It's all going to be for the benefit of defense. However, as we start to see state and local governments and eventually the federal government begin to adopt infrastructure projects, and when they build up waterways, canals, and roads, and so on and so forth, it's going to have the indirect benefit of benefiting trade, because it will begin to connect the nation like never before. But anyways, let's focus on some of the infrastructure buildup that we will see immediately after the end of the War of 1812. Now, some of the infrastructure that we'll see first build up will be the roads that we see across the nation. Now, many of the nation's roads were in deplorable conditions. Now, with the exception of a few major cities, there were no major paved roads. Not to mention, you don't have national, I don't want to say highways, but national roads that would connect a city, say, in the east with the city in the west. And there will be a call to build up things like turnpikes, intersections, as well as other national roads all throughout the American frontier to better connect the nation. Not to mention, as we start to see the buildup of these roads, there will be innovations done mainly to horse-drawn carriages that will help improve transportation time. So you, as a trader, could trade a product much quicker or travel much quicker than before. We'll see this most notably with Conestogas. However, as the nation begins to go on the turnpike boom and begin to build up roads all across the nation, this isn't going to be the only matters of infrastructure that they were interested in building up to improve trade and to improve the national web. We'll also see that they would be interested in building up waterways, as well as building canals, which I'll add under this section too. Now, in particular, waterways at the time, and what I'm referring to here is rivers. They were seen as the main highways of the nation, connecting the nation east and west, north and south, and so on and so forth. We talked about how this was the case back in even before the arrival of the Europeans in American history. But anyways, they will look to better improve travel upon these waterways. This is where we will see they will try to introduce steamboats to these waterways to quickly transfer goods up and down either the Mississippi River or the various rivers that are across the nation. And by 1807, before the war, after the innovation of the steamboat of the steamboat itself, we'll see after the end of the War of 1812, America is going to go on a steamboat building splurge to where they would construct some 700 steamboats over the course of the next 2 decades, which will revolutionize travel on the waterways, speed it up, and allow them to travel upriver against current, something they could not do before. Meanwhile, as they are building up steamboats to improve travel on the waterways, they were also looking to create their own man-made waterways, or what we better recognize as canals. And we see this to take place immediately after the end of the War of 1812 up in New York. Now, New York itself, its major trading highway was that of the Hudson River. And the hope of New Yorkers was for some way they could get the Hudson River to connect with the Great Lakes. Because if the Hudson River could connect with the Great Lakes, all of that trade throughout Upper Canada as well as the American Northwest, it would go through the Hudson River, go through New York City, and benefit their economy. And in 1817, we'll see that New Yorkers will sponsor a bill and also get federal funding to build up the Erie Canal to connect the Hudson River with Lake Erie. It will take 7 years for the Erie Canal to be constructed, but once it is completed, it would stretch over 363 miles of land, and it will connect New York City, basically, with the Great Lakes, stimulating trade in the region and beginning to expand markets, especially for New York, allowing for economic prosperity. Not to mention, it would divert trade out of Canada, now coming through the U.S., benefiting their markets. And lastly, another major form of infrastructure that we'll see built up during this period that will revolutionize trade will be that of railroads. Now, the railroad itself, it will be introduced 2 years after we see the introduction of the Erie Canal. Now, railways, they will be based first off of steam power and eventually by coal power, but they'll arrive over to the United States from England in 1827, and it's going to take the nation by storm. They travel at a speed unthinkable before this of 10 miles per hour. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot today. However, back during the 1900s, this is much quicker than any other forms of transportation, whether it was on the roads or on the waterways/canals. And if the Americans were to go on a splurge of building up railways all across the nation, not only could they connect major cities, but this could spur settlement and expansion for the nation, and it would connect markets like never before. And we'll see by the 1830s, America is going to undergo a railway boom, to where by the beginning of the Civil War, there would be roughly about 30,000 miles of tracks that would be constructed, connecting the various regions of the country and connecting America's major cities. And why is that so significant with not only railways, but also with the waterways, canals, and roads, is because it will connect markets like never before. And it will create, for the United States, a market-based economy. Now, what do I mean by a market-based economy? Well, to understand this, I want to turn the clock back to colonial America, to understand how the American economy worked. Now, we've talked about individuals who traded cash crops as well as other valuable goods. That makes up a very small minority of the American population during the 18th century. The average American living out on their own farm were self-sufficient farmers, eventually to what would be what Thomas Jefferson would refer to as the yeoman farmers, the individuals he wanted the nation to be built off of. They were self-sufficient because of the fact that there was inadequacies within transportation. They could not produce goods, well, we're going to take, for example, tomatoes, and be able to sell them in markets beyond their local region. The reason being is because it took so long for them just to travel between cities. In the case of New York to Boston, it took a week to travel. And as we all know, if you have fruit too long or have a vegetable too long, before you can get it to a market, it will expire, it will spoil. And so many Americans will not dabble into selling to markets outside of their locality. However, with the buildup of roads, waterways, railways, this will allow Americans to trade goods to new markets. It will increase their clientele, and more Americans are going to get involved in this market-based economy, to where they would trade, say, their tomatoes with cities beyond their reach that were now connected with these railways, with these waterways, with improved transportation times. And this will slowly begin to connect the nation. However, with this market-based economy, as it will help the U.S. economy flourish and eventually boil over into when America will become the leading trading power of the world by the 20th century, there are some cracks that will develop within this market-based society, especially with the buildup of this infrastructure, because In regards to railways and canals, most of them are being constructed in the north. Why is that significant? Well, it's because it will positively impact their economies, and since they were being fueled by tariffs to generate the revenue to build them, this comes at the expense of the South, a region that will not benefit as much from the buildup of this infrastructure. And that leads me to the next point, where with the market revolution, we start to see the formation of diverse economies. Now, first, we're going to talk about the economy in the north. It's going to be heavily impacted by the market revolution as well as the industrial revolution. Following the War of 1812, with these infrastructure improvements, as well as when we talk about the era of good feelings, the calling for tariffs, we'll start to see that the northern states are going to develop a sophisticated manufacturing sector. They will begin to establish communities that will be based around manufacturing plants, as well as later industrial plants. And we'll see more so in the north than we would see in the south. There will be a transition of Americans living in the countryside to living in the cities. Now, even by the time we get to the outbreak of the Civil War, most Americans in the north will be farmers. But nonetheless, we start to see that more and more Americans were traveling to the cities, working for wages, and participating in these industrial communities. These industrial communities will emerge after the end of the War of 1812, but we'll see by the 1820s they would take on a new life, mainly when we see the establishment of what's called the Low system, which would be established in Low, Massachusetts, to where at the center of that community would be the factory. And on the outskirts would be apartments and tenants, and those who would work in this initial industrial community that would serve a model for future towns would be American women, ironically. And we'll see that they would begin to form America's first unions as a result of the deplorable conditions within these mills. And we'll see that they would make up the bulk of the labor force for much of the 1820s. But that will change by the 1830s as we see more American men begin to transition over to this atmosphere. But the northern economy will become heavily influenced by these manufacturing plants. Meanwhile, in the South, their economy would not be centered around manufacturing plants that were devoted to creating finished goods, but rather, they are going to be focused on agriculture. And specifically, they will be focused on producing one major cash crop that we'll talk a lot about in days to come, that of cotton. Now, in 1794, as a result of this, really before the market revolution, as a result of the industrial revolution and the creation of new mechanized devices, we'll see one New Englander, ironically, by the name of Eli Whitney, is going to travel through the South, and he's going to hear of complaints from southern planters on the process of ginning cotton. He would find a solution to this and produce the cotton gin, which would allow them to gin cotton, take the cotton seed out of the fibers 50 times faster now than previously. Now, why is this significant? Well, it's cotton. I want you all to think, what is it used for? Well, it's used for your clothing. Now, prior to this, it was a luxury of the upper class. Only the individuals who could purchase cotton clothing were those with money, because it was in short supply. Most people would have to live off living in wool. However, that will change with the cotton gin because it will mass produce cotton. It can then mass produce cotton cloths. Actually, southern cotton would be sent off to northern manufacturing plants to where they would create clothes and then sell them off in European markets. And now that cotton was being mass produced, now that it could reach a wider audience, a larger customer base, it'll become much more profitable. And it will become the staple cash crop in the South, and it will completely revolutionize their society, especially in regards to that institution of slavery, because many Southerners, just to oversimplify it, they will realize if they can produce cotton 50 times faster, well, imagine if you have more slaves working for you. You could produce even more cotton. And that will influence the reinvigoration of slavery, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. But anyways, as we see these two very diverse economies begin to form as a result of the market revolution, American society is going to drastically change. Americans were beginning to move to the cities, and Southerners were staunchly staying in those agricultural communities. And with these divergent economies, with this changing American society, differences between these two sections will begin to emerge. And that will help us that will eventually lead us down the road, eventually to the Civil War, as these two sections begin to branch apart. We'll talk about that in a future lecture, and we'll also talk about the events that were coinciding with the market revolution when we talk about the era of good feelings the next time that we go into lecture. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and end the lecture on that note. Before I leave, just like always, make sure that you complete all outstanding assignments. Make sure that you read the corresponding readings with this topic, as well as read the corresponding chapter within the textbook. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe. I'll see you all next time.